Thank you for joining us, Senator. Good to be with all of you, and I want to say a special hello to our audience on C-SPAN that's checking in with us live today. I was just trying to warm up with the Senator, and I noticed that the coolest part of his profile is that he grew up on his family's cattle farm in Yell County, Arkansas. So I did what anyone asked. I said, were they milk cows or beef cows? And he goes, beef, and he said, and I said, well, did you have any of them as pets? And then,
well, since they end up dying so we can eat them, no.
well, I just want to, show how definitive you were about these matters. But
we had lots of ducks and geese and dogs and cats and everything.
So there's
else.
A friendly side of your pet heritage.
Yeah,
yeah, that's good. Let me ask you, you are vice chair of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, which means you are responsible, in a way, for what comes next in terms of the Republican footprint in the Senate. What would you consider to be a success? Like, what would you get fired for and say, wow, Tom did a really, really poor job? What would be an outstanding job? When you come out and we have the election, how many seats do you think you will have won that will beat expectations?
Well, the baseline is, of course, that we want to hold the majority in the Senate, because I think America will be safer and more prosperous with a Republican Congress and a Republican president. We have 54 seats now, which means we're going to need to hold or lose no fewer than 3 or 4, depending on who wins the presidency. But I still feel very good about where our incumbent senators and our candidates are positioned. We've always known this would be a tough Republican cycle. We have something like 24 senators running for re-election. The Democrats only have about 10. Most of the competitive races are taking place in purple or blue states, but we also have a lot of great senators, people like Ron Johnson, Rob Portman here from Ohio, Pat Toomey, Kelly Ayotte, who are very good politicians in addition to being good senators, good fits for their state. I'm confident they're going to win, and we have a lot of good candidates running in other states as well, like Joe Heck, a brigadier general and surgeon in the Army National Guard, or Army Reserve, I should say, who's running to take Harry Reid's place in Nevada. So we know it's going to be a tough cycle. We know the races are going to be close, but I feel pretty good about the slate of senators and candidates we have running.
So if it doesn't come in, right now you feel good about that as you come in, and a lot of people are looking at, what if you come in at 49 or 50? Will that feel like that was then a mandate carried by the other side, or do you think it's more structural circumstances?
Well, I would be disappointed, not only because we would not have the majority with 49 or fewer, maybe 50, if Hillary Clinton were to win the White House, but I'd also be disappointed because that would mean so many of the people who I've gotten to know and with whom I've served over the last couple of years, who I think are very patriotic Americans and very capable senators, would probably have lost their race as well. But I'm pretty confident that that's not going to be the case, that we're going to hold our own in the Senate.
One of the questions I want to ask you is, I think many of us have on their mind, particularly here in Cleveland, is sort of how many GOP islands are there out there that you need to unite? I mean, when you go around the country and you have this responsibility of tying the party together, succeed in different places like New Hampshire, in Ohio, going down in the South, the issue range is enormous. And you've said this in your own support of Donald Trump, but how big is that bandwidth? How wide is that band that you folks have to bring your people along? And what are the issues that matter most as you go talk to the American public?
Well, we certainly have a very diverse country. We're a continental nation with 325 million Americans, and Arkansas is very different from Maine, for instance. Maine is represented by Susan Collins, and Susan Collins and I work very closely together on a whole range of issues. That doesn't mean we see eye to eye on every issue, but she's one of my closest friends in the Senate. And she's a good fit for her state, just like Kelly Ayotte is a good fit for her state, Pat Toomey for his, and I am for mine. But in the end, whether you're a Mainer or a New Hampshireite or an Arkansan, I think you share some basic concerns. Most people, because most people are not rich, haven't seen a pay raise in the last 8 years. And they've seen the cost of living go up, especially the cost of their health care. Middle class, working poor families are struggling to make ends meet. They're struggling to pay for their health care. They're worried about the kind of chaos we see on the streets around the country today, whether it's racist cop killers assassinating police officers for the second time in just a week, or whether it's the threat of Islamic terrorism from the kind of shootings we've seen in San Bernardino and Orlando, or the kind of awful attack we saw last week in Nice that could very easily be brought to our shores. So when you look around the country, although we have a very diverse country, very diverse people, I think at root they have the same kind of concerns everywhere you go.
Now, I noticed you were you were in Aspen Ideas Festival with the Atlantic and Aspen Institute help organize. Another person that was there while you were there was Caitlyn Jenner. And Caitlyn came out, said, Donald Trump is the person she wants, and that Donald Trump would be great for the trans community in America. Does that bandwidth work for you?
Well, I think we want to appeal to every American of all stripes in all 50 states. Now, it's clear that we don't always appeal to every Republican in a state like, say, California. We've had some tough times, even though it used to be a Republican state. But we want to be a party of all Americans. The Democrats, over the last several decades, have been a party that is a very eclectic and diverse group of voters, some of whom don't always share the same common themes. But they find a way to stitch them together in election after election. We as Republicans want to appeal to Americans as Americans, be they old or young, be they black or white or Hispanic, be they man or woman. We want to appeal to all Americans across a common set of concerns.
And trans Americans.
And with gay, straight, or trans, yes.
I just heard in the Washington Post that in the Republican platform, a provision was taken out or stripped out about that I know you cared about the ability of the United States and preference of the United States to sell Ukraine weapons, offensive weapons in part, but weapons in part to defend themselves against Russian aggression or hybrid Russian aggression. And the fact that this has been taken out of the GOP platform is one that I would find to be somewhat at odds with a lot of people who are worried about the national security equities of the country right now. How do you square that? How do you have that conversation in a smart way with your caucus? Because I think if I could, imagine if that had happened in the Democratic caucus, and I don't know what's in the platform on the Democratic platform with regard to Ukraine and Russia.
Well, given how many Democrats oppose the president's policy on that front, it may very well happen.
Yeah. But it'd be very interesting because I can imagine you sort of raising, some big red flags and saying that would be something that would concern you. So, do you have those similar concerns about your own party platform?
So I'll confess first, I haven't reviewed finally all 40,000 plus words of the platform as it was written and will be adopted this week. So I don't know specifically what it says. I, of course, think that we should have long ago provided Ukraine with some of the weapons and the additional intelligence they need to defend their own territorial sovereignty from Russian aggression. I'm not alone in that in the Republican Party, but as I mentioned, the Democratic Party as well. Early last year, most members of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Democrat and Republican alike, called for that. Many members we now know from reporting of the Obama administration called for that early on. President Obama has continued to resist it. When it comes to a platform, though, on foreign policy and national security matters, I think that being very specific and detailed sometimes is not called for just because the world is so dynamic and we don't know what necessarily it will look like come January 20th as compared to the summer of 2016. That's the case every 4 years. So I think on foreign policy and national security in particular, what a platform should do is announce the basic principles we have as a party. How we handle a particular situation when there's a new president, when there's a new Congress, really is a matter of practical judgment of applying those principles. I hope Ukraine doesn't need new defensive weapons in January, because I hope that Russia has withdrawn all of its support for the rebels and withdrawn their troops from Crimea, and they have sovereign territory again.
You worry a lot about national security, and I'm interested in what you worry about most. And when I travel around the world, when you travel around the world, I think it's hard not to feel the worry that other leaders have about American withdrawal.
So there's a lot of worries, unfortunately, when it comes to our national security. The most immediate, the most urgent, clearly, is the threat of terror attacks, including the threat of mass terror attacks. We had almost 50 Americans killed in Orlando. In Nice, France last week, there were 84 people killed, to include Americans, just being run down by a cargo truck. And Lord knows what the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda would do if they could get their hands on even more deadly weapons. But more broadly, looking around the world to other adversaries like Russia, like China, rogue states like Iran and North Korea, I worry about the loss of American deterrence and American credibility. Deterrence, once lost, is a very hard thing to regain. Deterrence is a combination of both your ability to use force to protect your interest and your willingness to use them. And the point of having a credible deterrent is not to have to use force. One of the reasons we have the world's strongest military is so we don't have to use the military to begin with, so our adversaries know not to challenge us. But unfortunately, over the last 8 years, we've seen an erosion in our capabilities. because the military has seen budget cuts over $1 trillion. We're doing everything we can just to keep our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who are on the front line properly trained and equipped, which is eating into the seed corn for future generations. But also, we've seen a loss of the credibility of our threat, most spectacularly in the famous red line in Syria, where Barack Obama drew a red line about the use of chemical weapons in Syria and then didn't enforce that red line. And as you travel, you know that you go to different security systems and they have very different issues, whether it's Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. But the one thing they all have in common is the United States, and specifically United States credibility. And it has struck me when you go into security systems outside the Middle East, how many leaders, heads of state, foreign ministers, defense ministers, will specifically cite the red line as a concern of theirs and what it means for U.S. security guarantees to them.
If that red line had been triggered, we had taken action and attacked Assad in one way or another, but it had potentially led to some escalation with Russia and led to the dispersion or loss of control of chemical weapons, would those have been tolerable costs to have had versus the taking action on the red line?
Well, so first I would take issue with the premise of the question. I wouldn't say that it would have led to an escalation with Russia. Russia escalated in Syria in part because they saw the United States was not willing to defend our interests there and to defend the interest of our allies. But second, the deal that we ended up cutting was not only a massive loss of credibility for the United States, it also did not deter Syria from continuing to use chemical weapons against their own people, giving themselves a decisive advantage against some of the opposition forces there. For a long time it was chlorine. There's since been reports they're once again using sarin gas. So I think there are real practical implications of that failure in Syria, in addition to what I'm talking about in the broader security systems around the world.
When you were a soldier, and we all want to thank you for your service. You were a soldier, you went over, you've been an attorney and went over, and I'm sure you're in touch with many of the people you fought with. I'm interested in soldiers that have returned back, and maybe they haven't gotten on the senator track or public service, but I think many of them have come back and run into an economy that's been pretty rough on them, that's been tough for them to find jobs and positions. I know a lot of relatives I have in Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas, and many of them who support Donald Trump have been frustrated that they've gone out to sacrifice for the country, and when they come home, there's no job. How have your colleagues and associates in the military have felt that? Have you felt that? Have you felt the kind of deal was broken by America somewhere?
So I have friends who have struggled to find work or find work that's suited to their experiences and skill sets.
So people you fought with?
Sure. People I fought with, people I trained with, stateside and so forth. I think that's partly the result of a lot of businesses not appreciating the skill sets and attributes you gain in the military. Take me and my soldiers, for instance. We were infantrymen. You don't get to knock out bunkers and tank trench lines very often in the civilian world, but you learn intangible skills that are valuable to any company. Mm-hmm. Leadership, mission focus, discipline, teamwork, and so forth. And take Walmart, for instance, which does a great job of hiring veterans in my state. Walmart can train anyone to operate a supply chain. They can teach people to run their inventory system. They can't teach, though, what we learned in combat. Mm-hmm. And I think there needs to be more companies in the world like Walmart who appreciate not just the tangible skills that a soldier can bring, because some of them are directly transferable. If you were a pilot in the Air Force, you can become a pilot for an airline, for instance. If you were a logistics specialist, you can go straight to work for, say, FedEx. But the intangible skills and attributes that all veterans have, that they can take on a job, they get the kind of on-the-job training that most workers are going to need anyway. So that's the first thing. The second thing is just, in general, as you said, our military is disproportionately represented by states like Arkansas and Missouri and Oklahoma and other states. And in many of those states, the economy has not been doing as well as we might like. As I said in the outset, most voters are concerned about the well-being of their family and being able to put food on the table for it. And we see an economy in which that bottom 80% of households, so you go from the working poor all the way up to the middle class, upper middle class even, haven't seen a real pay increase, haven't experienced any economic growth. It's going to be hard on those folks in those areas to get jobs, and it just so happens that they're disproportionately supplying the new recruits for our military.
So when you hear Donald Trump speaking to that community, and I do, I listen to him, I say, I understand. I've got about 100 second cousins, and 97 of them support Donald Trump, and the other Three of them are sort of looking and saying, we don't get each other. But a lot of it has to do with this notion of service and this inability to get jobs. What is that like inside the Republican caucus, though? Because this seems to be a very new current, at least in terms of my observation. So how deep is that? You said you support Donald Trump, you support your nominee who will be nominated this week. Are all the Republican leaders jumping on that message?
So first on the veterans issue, yes, Donald Trump has been a very strong advocate for veterans. He laid out an important set of policy reforms a couple of weeks ago in his speech. Some of those build upon what we in the Congress did 2 years ago with the VA Choice Act, trying to empower veterans in their local communities rather than always funneling them into one big institution at a VA hospital. Some of it's also about getting the economy moving together so everyone can find a job, to include veterans. No one's going to agree with everyone all the time. I have lots of disagreements with my colleagues in the Senate on issues. I have some disagreements with Donald Trump as well, but I think America will be safer and more prosperous with a Republican president and a Republican Congress than I do with a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress. Our agenda is better than their agenda.
Have you hung out with Donald Trump much?
I wouldn't say we've hung out now, but
have you sat down and talked?
No, he's been to. I mean, not one-on-one, but he's been to Washington and met with senators in Congress, as recently as last week.
But does he say, Tom Cotton, national security guy, I need to sit down? Because you've said that when he finally reads the intel that you've read, he'll think differently. And has he acknowledged that in any way?
Well, so I've said, most recently when Donald was in Washington and visiting with senators, as I had suggested to him back in March, that our military needs substantial increase in its budget. And that's going to have to start, in my opinion, early next year with an emergency supplemental spending bill. You can debate about the amount of money. Obviously, in the middle of the fiscal year, the Department of Defense can only assume so much new money and get it properly programmed for the year. But we need, in the first 100 days, to have an emergency military plus up, and then build upon that in the next annual budget to get back to something like we would have been if we hadn't seen these drastic cuts. And I think Donald Trump strongly supports that, and he said that publicly, that he strongly supports increasing our defense budget. Again, not so we can fight and win the war that we might be facing in the future, but so we can stop that war from happening in the first place, as we did through much of the Cold War.
What would you advise him to do on something like Iran? So we're 1 year into the Iran deal and the Iran anniversary, and some are saying it's a mixed record, that in one hand you've got central cores and centrifuges taken apart. There are a lot of very measurable points of success. We haven't had a rapprochement in relations, if that was part of it. But Donald Trump said he wouldn't rip up the deal; he would keep the deal. Ted Cruz said he would rip up the deal, and other people would. What would you advise him when he comes in, if he were to win office? Should he stake out with regards to something like the Iran arrangement?
Well, Iran is not following the deal, and the deal is not in our national interests. So I would suggest walking away from it. This is one of those instances, though, where you don't know what the world will look like in 6 months. Just a couple of weeks ago, Chancellor Merkel and the German intelligence service outlined some ways in which Iran has been cheating on the deal. Maybe they'll cheat in many more ways, and it'll build consensus among Western countries as well as in Washington that we do need to walk away from the deal. But the deal in the long term does not serve U.S. interests, not just in the nuclear elements of it, which are the gravest and longest lasting, and that's largely what the German intelligence service reported on a couple weeks ago, but also in Iran's conventional aggression around the region, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and its support for terrorism and so forth. The president promised that the nuclear deal, which would get the nuclear issue off the table, which I would say it didn't, but let's just assume that he's right about that, would allow the United States to confront Iranian aggression. It's done exactly the opposite as so many people predicted at the time. It has empowered Iran to be even more aggressive, daring the president to take a chance of confronting them and them walking away from the deal, because the Ayatollahs know that the United States wants it more than they do, and therefore they can continue their reign of terror and their aggression around the region. They can even cheat on the deal itself, and the United States is not going to call them on it.
You and Mike Lee jumped out right away, right after Brexit, and said we need to negotiate a separate trade deal with Britain. You jumped on it, sort of, we said we need to hug Britain real quickly and hold. So what's that going? Are you more tilting towards the UK, a little bit away from Europe? I mean, how do you sort of look at that triangulation of the relationship?
So I think it's natural that the United States and the United Kingdom will have a special relationship, as we have for so long. I think it was very.
But why not with France?
You know, we weren't birthed down in the UK. You know, they aren't our big brothers. You know, we're part of the Anglosphere. We're part of the British tradition, along with countries like Canada and New Zealand and Australia. And as much as we may be allied with continental nations, and they're part of NATO, and we give them security guarantees, and vice versa, I mean, it's natural that we have a closer relationship than with almost any country in the world with Great Britain. I think it was deeply, deeply regrettable the way President Obama and some European leaders were trying to intimidate the British people in the middle of the vote, not just expressing their opinion that a vote to leave the EU would be bad, not just for the EU, but bad for Great Britain, but implying that there would be threats and punitive consequences as well. You know, Barack Obama said in London that Europe would or the UK would have to go to the back of the queue. Leaders in Brussels and other capitals said that there would be serious consequences and there would be punitive action taken against the UK. I would say, you know, since the campaign ended, campaign rhetoric can often get very heated, whether it's over a referendum like that or when you have two candidates running. Cooler heads usually prevail. The interests of the players usually prevail. It's clearly in the interest of the UK and the EU to have an amicable trading relationship, just like it is for the United States and the UK as well. So I think we should, the bill that Mike and I introduced would simply preserve the status quo, so nothing changes when the UK and the EU have their separation, and then we can start a new round of negotiations with the UK. I mean, we have bilateral trade relationships with a country like Oman.
Right.
Clearly, we're going to have it with the world's fifth largest economy and a UN Security Council permanent member and one of our closest NATO allies.
When you look at your party, and I think you're part of the sort of strategic helm, helping to run things and think about what you need to organize for the future. What do you think the blind spots of the Republican Party are right now?
I think for too long we haven't had an agenda that focuses on the anxieties and the concerns of working class Americans. I think that's something into which Donald Trump has tapped. Take for instance.
Were you shocked at how well he did?
No, I was not. I mean, in 2013, I was one of the lead opponents in the House of Representatives of the so-called Gang of Eight immigration bill. Our voters clearly, for a long time, like most voters in America, have wanted less immigration. Immigrants are by and large very good people that come to America because they want to provide better for themselves and their families. And we're all, in one way or another, children of immigrants. But our immigration policy should be focused on a single objective: what is in the best interest of the American people? And that's true whether you took the oath of citizenship last week or whether your parents came over on the Mayflower. And so many times, over and over again, in 2006, 2007, and then in 2013, a bill like the Gang of Eight that would increase immigration at a time when people were struggling to get jobs or get wages almost got through Congress, only to be stopped by popular uprising. And I think too many of our party leaders interpreted wrongly the signals that the voters were sending to the party leaders in Washington, in the same way that European leaders have been interpreting the signals incorrectly that their voters have been sending. So Donald tapped into a sentiment among the American people that Washington was not working for them, that our economy was moving too slowly, that it was really a dual-track economy, that there's a lot of policies that weren't going to serve the best interest of the American people, certainly the broad middle class, whether it was increasing levels of legal immigration or increasing debt or piling more and more regulations on businesses, especially small businesses and so forth.
So let me put you on the spot. A lot of people think there's a good chance in 2020 or 2024 you might be a candidate for, you might have a big party and a big convention in some unannounced city. I'm really interested, one of the big issues we see out in the square that's happening in the country right now are racial tensions. Black Lives Matter, police killing one way or another black people. We've now had ambushes and, as you said, assassinations of police officers. As you look forward in the party, as you look forward in your own personal career, what do you have to get right to begin dealing with that racial issue, that racial divide? What does the party and what does Tom Cotton need to move the needle on with regard to race in this country?
Well, the first thing we have to do is make it clear that any attack on police officers is abhorrent, and it's an attack on civil society and the rule of law itself. And that we, as a people, as civilians who live under the protection of police officers, and we as political leaders admire, respect, support, and yes, love those police officers who go out every day and put their lives on the line. There are wives and children now in Baton Rouge and Dallas who are not going to have their husbands and their dads come home. In some ways, it's harder than what soldiers have to face. We went overseas, and my family was worried about me, but I got back, and then they knew things were going to be fine. I was at Fort Campbell, I was at Fort Myer, what have you. When you're a police officer, every single day is like that. You leave and you don't know what the next stop is going to hold, and your loved ones don't know if you're going to walk through the door or if a police officer in a dress uniform is going to knock on the door. So the first thing we have to do is make it clear that we support the police, and we will give them the benefit of the doubt, and we will stand with them. Anytime there's a use of force by a police officer, to include a shooting, there's an investigations, facts are discovered. I think it's particularly important for political leaders that we not jump to conclusions, that we do nothing to fan the flames of racial tension and division until we know the facts, until we know what actually happened. You just saw today the fourth straight acquittal of officers in Baltimore, that a city that was torn apart with violence just last year, that has seen a 65% increase in its murder rate over the last year. A 65% increase in a murder rate that is particularly hitting black communities inside of Baltimore. Right. So I think it's important that political leaders show their support for law enforcement and do everything we can not to fan the flames of racial tension, but to let investigations proceed, find the facts, support law enforcement where they made the right decision, and if they acted inappropriately or if they acted outside the law, hold them accountable the same way we as soldiers were.
Is there something we should do on the other? I had Michael Steele on stage this morning where he acknowledged that he himself has been stopped many times for no reasons by police in Maryland and others, and he's sort of given his. So I'm just sort of interested on the other side of the equation. What do we need to do to sort of rebuild trust within over racial divides in the country?
Well, frankly, I think a lot of political leaders need to stop fanning the flames of racial division. Because there is a police shooting does not mean the police are racist or that police officer did anything wrong. You cannot know that until there's an investigation that takes place. And when people go on TV or they go in the streets and they call the police racist or they insinuate that the police are racist without a factual basis, only have police officers exonerated months later when a board of inquiry or a prosecuting attorney or a judge or a jury finds that a shooting was justified, does nothing to promote racial harmony and unity in our country.
So how are 2020 and 2024 looking for you?
A long way off.
Okay. Let me open up the floor to questions. We have it. Adam Credo right here in the front. We're going to get you a microphone.
Yeah, sure.
So.
Oh, yeah, sure. Hi.
Adam.
Thank you. Adam Credo from the Washington Free Beacon. As we were speaking here, the Associated Press just broke. They obtained a secret document about the Iran deal that shows that restrictions will actually be lifted in less than 10 years, actually halving the amount of time that it could take Tehran to build a nuclear weapon. I was curious for reaction, as well as some comment on the fact that Iran now has tested, I believe, their fourth ballistic missile. The UN has condemned this action. The administration has as well. I'm curious your thoughts about that UN report and the administration.
Thanks, Adam.
So I can't comment on a breaking report. I can just say that it would not be surprising to me at all to see those restrictions in the nuclear deal lifted within 10 years or Iran violate them in the meantime. Remember, we did a similar deal with North Korea, and they detonated a nuclear device only 12 years later.
I would point out the documents
indicate
that it was that initial reports from the administration on what the deal would do were actually misleading, that this is not what you were told as part of the deal.
I'm shocked that the administration might have misled the American people about the Iran deal. I'm truly shocked. I think the second question was about ballistic missiles. I was talking earlier and this is what Chancellor Merkel and the German intelligence services were discussing in part a couple of weeks ago when they said that Iran is violating the nuclear deal and the associated UN Security Council resolutions. Look, Iran has plenty of missiles that can reach their adversaries in Sunni countries or in Israel. There's only one reason for them to be testing long-range ballistic missiles, and that is to hold at risk first Europe and ultimately the United States of America.
Alice.
Okay. Thank you. First off, on a serious note, I want to congratulate you again for retaining your title as the fastest man in Congress.
That's a low bar to clear.
Exactly. Being from Arkansas, what do you see as Hillary Clinton's biggest liabilities as she faces off against Donald Trump?
No one trusts her, nor should anyone trust her. Hillary Clinton has been in the public eye for 25 years, and she had repeatedly lied to the American people. Look at what Director Comey said last week. Not his legal conclusion with which lawyers can debate, but the lie that he put to Hillary Clinton's various assertions. She said she used one device for convenience. We now know that it was multiple devices. She said that she did not send or receive emails that were information that was classified at the time. We now know that she did in fact do so, over 100 of them, some of them extremely highly classified. She said that she turned over all work-related emails. We know that that's not the case either. They found many among the deleted emails, many work-related emails. She said that the State Department authorized it. We now know that's not the case at all. And she said there was no chance of a breach of her server by hostile power, which was laughable at the time, which Director Comey could not corroborate, and in all likelihood did happen. He even said that she took her personal computing devices overseas to the territories of hostile powers. I don't have to tell you which countries that's mean. I will just give you, by example, I do not take a single electronic device anywhere overseas, not even to Canada, because of the sensitivity that high-ranking government officials have to consider the threat of information security by foreign intelligence services.
Before we leave that question, I want to go right here. Can you give sort of an equal frame on the other side of it? When many journalists like myself have gone back to look at some of Mr. Trump's comments, donations to philanthropy, we have a really hard time on the truth side of the equation, right? Or the validity issue. And so when you have that question, there's just no doubt that you're right that trust is a big issue for Hillary Clinton, but it seems to be a big issue for Donald Trump too. And so I'm interested in how you would handicap that on both sides.
Well, I just think, you see this from common experience. We certainly know about it in Arkansas, but you also see it in the pollings. The American people simply do not trust Hillary Clinton to tell the truth. Now, I know a lot of people, quibble with Donald Trump and some of his assertions, and he's failed a few fact-checking tests from fact-checkers in the media.
Just a couple.
I would suggest that fact-checkers typically are liberal editorialists who are gussied up as fact-checkers.
I know. I'll get you some that are not.
and that they're not checking facts like I just laid out about Hillary Clinton, but they're making arguments about matters of opinion and policy, which is fine, but they shouldn't be calling themselves fact-checkers.
Right here, and then we'll wrap this up. Yeah.
Alex Emmons with The Intercept. Earlier this year, you gave an address to the Hudson Institute in which you said that the U.S. has an under-incarceration problem, but the U.S. has the highest per capita incarceration rate of any country in the world, including North Korea. So my question is, do our allies need to lock more people up, or is there a compelling reason why the U.S. needs a higher incarceration rate than the rest of the world?
So I'm specifically referring to a myth, and that is the myth that we have an over-incarceration problem and that we need to let thousands of violent felons back out on our streets. If you look at rates of offense versus rates of conviction and imprisonment, it's something like, I don't have the exact numbers in my head right now, but less than half of violent crime committed in this country ultimately ends up with someone behind bars. I think less than a fifth of property crime ends up with someone behind bars. I don't see how you can think about those numbers and think that 4/5 of all the victims of property crimes and over half of the victims of violent crimes, assault, rape, murder, get no justice from our criminal justice system and think that we are imprisoning too many people and that we should be letting those people out. And that's one reason why I think people feel increasingly unsafe on the streets, because we've seen crime rise over the last 2 years, which I would suggest is not coincidental that it's also been in the last 2 years when some of the worst kinds of anti-police propaganda has been put out, sometimes by political leaders.
Is there any wiggle room that in there for you? Because I know the Koch brothers have been working very hard with many of your colleagues to find some compromise on incarceration.
Well, I don't think after the events of the last few weeks that many Americans want to let violent felons back out on the street. I should clarify that I'm talking about the federal prison system.
Right.
State prison systems, I can't account for all 50 systems. I personally don't think that low-level, nonviolent, first-time offenders, drug users, drug addicts should be put in prison or jail as a primary matter. We should always try to find ways to divert them into juvenile justice camps, into drug treatment, community service, probation, that sort of thing. And that's the case in the federal prison system. Less than 0.5% of federal prisoners are in prison for any kind of offense like drug possession. And believe me, most of those pleaded down. But you're only talking about a few hundred people in the federal prison system. If you're in the federal prison system, you are almost certainly a hardened, violent, or repeat offender. So I don't personally think that we should put low-level drug offenders or drug users or addicts in. I don't think that's the best thing for them. I don't think it's the best thing for our society. Arkansas, by and large, doesn't do that. I can't speak to 49 other states. But in the federal system, if you're in federal prison, you're probably a bad person.
Two more quick questions. One of your Republican strategist colleagues out there made a comment about the Times and saying, in some areas of the country, Donald Trump really sells and works. In some areas of the country, it's like being stranded in the middle of the ocean, holding on to the outside of a boat with Donald Trump pulling you down. And I'm interested in
people feel that way about Hillary Clinton, too.
what's going to happen here this week? Is this all going to work? Is the party going to come together? Do you feel like the plate tectonics are converging, or are they pulling apart?
I hope so, and I think so. But I'd say that party unity, which is the word of the day, is not enough. We can't just be a unified party. We have to be a growing party, and we have to reach new voters in new places who haven't been voting for us in recent elections. Let's just face the facts. We've lost 2 straight presidential elections. We haven't won the popular vote in 5 out of 6. We're not a majority of America's Republicans. Now, the good news is Democrats aren't a majority either, but it's not enough to unify Republicans. We have to grow our party and reach voters who haven't been voting for us in presidential elections, even though they have been voting for us in other elections. So I hope that what you'll hear from the convention this week is not something that's just going to help bring Republicans together, but help bring the millions of independents and Democrats to our side who want an America that's going to be safer and more prosperous.
So last time I interviewed you, you had a baby the next day. This time, about a week ago, you announced that you and your wife announced you're about to have another child is on the way. So final question, have you picked out names?
No, do you have any bright ideas?
I don't know, Tom, Steve.
Stephen, yeah. No, we just
Barack.
We just announced last week that we're expecting a Christmas baby. We're gonna have a son due on Christmas.
Well, that's great. Congratulations. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Tom Cotton. Great, thank you so much.
I appreciate it. Thank you.